In the previous video, I talked about drones, UAVs, uninhabited area vehicles, as creating or problematizing the notion of warfare in terms of making it riskless, right? Well, here in this video, I want to talk about two other aspects that come out of introducing the artificial intelligence into war via drones, namely recreational warfare and proliferation of it. So recreational warfare, what does that mean? Well, it's some people are worried that introducing drones into warfare can turn war into a kind of video game. Right? You think about it. Instead of simply sitting in front of a screen and killing zombies or killing spaceships or whatever, you're actually killing human beings. But to the drone operator, what's the difference, right? Sometimes this has been compared to, bomber pilots in the Second World War, being high altitude pilots, and it was just a kind of game, just pulling levers because you didn't see what was going on the ground. You flew over at night, you pulled a few levers, and maybe the thrill of a night flight, and then you return home, and you really don't see the type of destruction that you're unleashing. So wouldn't it be if people were basically playing with these drones all the time, we're like using them, wouldn't it turn into a kind of game? Wouldn't that just be a natural sort of psychological consequences? It would lead ultimately, what's the problem with this? It could lead to a lax attitude about killing because basically the operator is removed from all the mess and the agony, and it's you go and drive from your house to maybe some suburb and sit in a computer room and operate the drones and then go home. You don't see any of this. So what's that going to do to the human mind that does that all day? It's just a day at the office. And so this attitude, this is a deontological point, that essentially this is an immoral attitude, that what we're going to get through this involvement with drones is we're going to get people with immoral attitudes. Now, you might say, so what? What's the big deal about that? You have an immoral attitude, it's just an attitude. Well, of course, the question really is, what will that do in terms of human behavior? Will this ultimately, as you adopt this sort of more of a lax attitude about killing, will you become, even through the continued use of this, more and more likely to be, to use just an old expression, more trigger happy, where you're going to get drone operators will start, using more and more and more force because they just have a more cavalier attitude about it. So the moral problem is not necessarily just the attitude. The moral problem is really what the attitude will lead to. What will be the results of this? Now, this is an interesting question, but it is a question. That is it really the case that drones will lead to people seeing war as a giant video game? Yeah, again, you can find lots of science fiction novels and stories about technology or fighting wars completely through technology, and then the horror, all the horror is sort of taken out of it, and it just continues and perpetuates the war. And the people involved do treat it like a video game. They do treat it as just part of life, and it's almost on the level of a weird amusement. But that's in stories. Is there really good evidence to support this? And this becomes now an empirical question. This is something you'd have to find evidence based on examinations of drone operators versus other troops. No doubt that one becomes desensitized, and that's part of training, is to overcome a natural, more or less, human inertia that tends to, try to escape violence and not go in for the kill, to turn people that can do it. But just because you're training someone to do it, does that mean they're going to get this eventual lax attitude? And so you would need to compare drone operators with people that have been trained in other aspects. Is a drone operator necessarily more quote unquote trigger happy than just, shall we say, a regular soldier? So this is something that we would need to to examine. This is an empirical question. So one of the important things about looking at artificial intelligence and in warfare and the philosophical and the ethical implications of it, of course, is to do one's homework and recognize when a question is an empirical question. So I'm going to leave that at that, because you would need to do an analysis and make sure that you can account for some kind of difference, if there is one, in terms of something that has eliminate other kinds of variables, so that you could say definitely yes, the use of drones does create a certain kind of attitude, or maybe not. You'd have to wait and see what the evidence says. And then, of course, evidence is always up for interpretation. Now, in addition, there are proportionality problems with drones. Typically it's difficult to count and establish proportionalities. If you have a drone strike that it has an acceptable kind of collateral damage, and if the damage occurs but the strike is not successful, and then you have another window, let's say the following week, to carry out the strike again, do you start fresh in your casualty count, or do you incorporate the first one? So then there's debates on how proportionality problems apply, proportionality estimates, how do those apply in drone warfare as well? So there are a couple of issues, and they're complex, in order to even ascertain how proportionality applies when it comes to drones. All right. Now, the last one I want to look at of the three, so riskless, recreational, now proliferation, and that's somewhat connected to the recreational problem. But in a previous video, I mentioned that drones are extremely expensive, and I drew the analogy of with fighter jets and aircraft carriers. Expensive to build, expensive to run. However, this kind of technology is becoming cheaper, and there's no question that operating drones is far less expensive than operating other kinds of military machinery. So in that sense, in the larger picture, drones, all things considered, do reduce the costs of war, and not just in terms of separating drone operators from the battle space and sort of reducing that kind of element on the operators, but it's a lot cheaper to fight with drones. So now that's another question, is if the economic expense starts to plummet with this, is it the case that more states would be more likely to go to war with drones than they would have been had they had to fight via other ways, and spending huge amounts of their GDP on aircraft carriers and heavier machinery? So this raises the other question: would we get the sort of the economic justification of war, that threshold, right? So if we think about it in just war terms, so to justify this cost to the economy, what if that cost starts to plummet? Well, that could make, shall we say, the threshold of justifying economic war, justifying the economics of war, could change as this drops. So this raises another problem, that basically that we would have more interventions here if drones were all available. Now, it might not be so bad if we were talking about, let's say, humanitarian intervention, if drones were used for that. So that creates a different side of the problem. You might get more proliferation of war, but you might get, humanitarian military interventions for humanitarian purposes. Those could be more easily justified. Now, so what does this end up with? Well, the concern really is over states fighting, raising the possibility of states fighting more unjustifiable wars if drones are readily available. Now, again, one would have to look at this from a more empirical angle. It's not, something that you can simply solve, but it's nonetheless, at the end of it all, it's quite a serious issue that with the advance in this technology, and as artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated and cheaper, that definitely the proliferation problem is arguably at the onset the most serious of the three.